for the streaming, you won't have sound anymore.
It doesn't conflict the sound.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's okay.
Great.
Thanks.
Hi everyone. My name is Bragg, and I do climate communication. The communication products that you figure out. And we're going to talk about actually creating your product. And to me, this is, I think, where I want to focus the most today. And within this, I'm really going to talk about the concept of story, why this is important, and sort of what that actually means in practice, and how you might start to do that in the context of research communication. And then finally, when you're done, promotion, getting your work out there, then we're going to do an active exercise and scientific resources. Okay, so first.
Excuse me. You have the wrong one. I'm sorry.
Sure. So first, before you even begin, first you want to think about, obviously, your audience and your desired outcomes. And I mean, I think most people, learn this growing up. Whenever you write, know your audience. But it is really important, and it's worth mentioning, because it's going to shape the tone, the format, and the content of the entire product that you make. I like this quote. It's about the curse of knowledge, which is a cognitive bias. Once you know, it is impossible to accurately remember what it's like to not know. So it's easy when you're writing to use vocabulary or make sometimes logical jumps that maybe you're very used to in your field, but that, depending on your audience, they may not make those jumps with you. So that's all I'm going to say about that. It's not unimportant, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory. So another decision before you actually communicate is deciding what format you're going to use. So again, this is based on the audience, the desired outcome, the message you want to create, and then probably most limiting are your resources. So what you have, the time, and the skills, and the money to do. So balancing all these, you have several options, not exclusively these, but video, this format called project, which I'll show an example of, photos, feature stories, other writing formats, and social media. I have social media in parentheses here because, well, I'll talk about it in a bit, but I don't see it as sort of on exactly the same level of those other kinds of content. And then, of course, any combinations of the above can also be done. So speaking a little bit about video and the pros and cons of video, the best thing about video is that you can show your audience instead of telling them. It's very easy to give the audience an idea of the place and personality and the features and the characteristics without shoving it down their throat or writing paragraphs of text to get them into a scene. So that's the best part. There's also the ability to include animation if you have the time, and it can be very easily engaging. Cons are that it's time, money, equipment and expertise. So not going to be available every time you want to communicate something. It also, because people have a short attention span, you really, I mean, unless you are doing like a full feature documentary, tends to be good to keep your videos at like maybe 3 minutes max. And there's really only a certain amount of information you can fit into 3 minutes. So it has the potential to be less informative than some other kinds of media. So I have, this is kind of an old video, and maybe you all have seen this, but I don't know, some of you have, but I think it's an example of how video can be very effective, but also doesn't fulfill every media need. Have you guys seen this? Has anyone not seen it? Oh. Yeah. So I'm happy to talk about what you guys think about that. I think it's sorry. I think it's obviously engaging and cute and fun. I think it's a good refresher if you kind of already know a little bit the history of the negotiations, but you're not going to be able to look at that and then suddenly you're going to totally get all of the UNFCCC and remember all of this. So, but it's good for grabbing people's attention and maybe getting them to like go to your website and find out like what you actually do as an organization. So then there's this format called Project, which is basically a slideshow that allows for some nice formatting, and it's an online platform, so you don't need, sorry, the font got a little messed up because I didn't do this in PowerPoint, but anyway, you don't need any special expertise or software, and you can embed videos in them. So they're pretty basic, but they're nice. And you can also link to specific slides. So if you have a video on one of the slides, you can link straight to that slide in other materials. But it is still just a slideshow, and people have to click through it. It's not as engaging as a video by itself. There's an example. Oops. This is one done by my boss. So this is about climate risks in the Sahel, and he went there and hung out with the scientists there. So you can see it's just like nice and online and simple, and anyone can do it. And then like here's a video interview of a scientist.
And it started with work that showed that it was the oceans that caused droughts.
Get the idea. Okay, then just photos by themselves. They're cheaper and easier than video. Imagery by itself can be very powerful, and it really allows you to focus the audience on exactly what you want them to see. Whereas in a video, there's a lot going on, and they may not be focused on exactly what you want them to be. But they often need the support of good captioning or to be featured with a blog post or something else. So standalone, a little bit's okay, but they're not going to tell the whole story. I'll just quickly show an example of photos. So these were just photos taken by our researchers in the field, you arm them with like a decent camera, and they can come up with some nice stuff. So this is just a slideshow embedded in a blog post with some captions that add detail that didn't really fit in the narrative of the story, like statistics or figures that are interesting in a caption and provide some richness to the story. Okay, writing, you can really develop the richest narrative. You have the most control over your audience's focus. No equipment really needed. But it still takes time, effort, and practice for good writing. And then, okay, so I differentiate between feature stories and then other kinds of writing. So feature stories are, very long, usually very character-driven, and I think often they can be the most engaging if they're done well, but they take a lot of time. So you have other options, including blogs, opinion pieces, information flyers, and fact sheets. The thing is that with a lot of those kinds of writings, especially like flyers and fact sheets, it's only going to appeal to a very specific audience, probably one that's already interested in what you're doing. So just be mindful, again, of your audience. So then social media I kind of have as a parallel category with format. I like to use it less for primary content and more for advertising your primary content, which is on your website or on a blog, and just trying to engage your audience through social media. Again, use it to connect with people and then direct them to your site. Obviously, like some primary content works on social media, especially photos, little tidbits of facts or stats, and then things like event coverage or live tweeting. But still, if you can link on your social media back to content on your website that's related, I think that is best. Okay, so the last thing before you actually start communicating is to read or watch high-quality content that you think is engaging. Even if it's in other fields, other science fields, other policy fields, and just look for what in that grabs you or what you find engaging. Okay, so now we're going to move into actually creating your project, and I'm going to focus on the concept of story. So I don't know, how much of a communications background you guys have, but usually it's always emphasized to present your ideas with a story, with characters and narrative. But I think in science this is easier said than done. So I'm going to talk about why it's so important first. Maybe. Oh. Hi. Okay. So I'm assuming that the primary objective of your writing and your communication is to influence someone somehow. whether that influence is just to get them to, listen to your ideas or to actually do something or to change their mind. But either way, this influence requires you to first get their attention and then to follow that up with actual engagement. So you have to grab attention and then get them to keep paying attention. This kind of full engagement usually requires the audience to feel somewhat emotionally involved in the story. And this is fundamentally challenging in science because usually scientists especially, or maybe even political scientists, don't want to involve emotion as much in the communication of their research. They want it to be very direct, very objective, just like their sciences. Of course, there are exceptions, but usually they like the story told just as they did their research. But I think it's important to push back on this. There's a lot of neuroscience research about the effectiveness of stories, so people actually remember facts way better if they're presented in a story form versus just a list of information. And not only that, but if people don't fully understand something, they fill in these gaps and make inferences and assumptions, and sometimes these might be, close to right, but sometimes they might really not be. And it leads to a lot of misinterpretation of information. But in story format, you're more likely to fill in those gaps yourselves as you're communicating the product or the research. And then finally, on top of that, we also interpret new information to support our existing beliefs and values. So it's just another layer of like getting your audience to actually get out of your story, what you want them to. Information alone can rarely change reluctant minds, and the only thing that replaces a story-based belief, which is usually emotional, is a better story. Which again is tricky in science because you're not, you're not trying to, it's not like you're trying to manipulate, but in reality, that's kind of what you're doing when you're communicating research. Okay, so what does this mean in practice? Like, what is a story? So Kendall Haven is a storyteller who talks about this kind of stuff for a living and does this. And he has this list of 8 elements that are required for a story structure. And I'm just going to go through them quickly. I have a handout that includes them, and I have resources that you guys can look at later with all of this information. So characters, that's essential number 1. This is just something I added. They don't have to be people. It could be, you could have a character of the Ebola virus, for example. But it does help if the reader can identify with your main character. So in that sense, it helps if it's a person. Traits. This is, what makes the character who they are. Goals. The character has to be going for something, and they have to have motive to make that goal important. They have to face conflicts and problems, relatedly risk and danger, and struggle. And all of these play into the element of tension and creating tension in your story, which is, again, what helps keep the audience engaged and interested. And then finally, details. So these are, sensory details, imagery, things that, again, help your reader imagine themselves in the story, help them identify with the character. And I think I would add humor to that list as well, although it's not necessary, and bad humor is not good either. So, yeah.
They're nice because most of the time, but if you could, sometimes I was thinking about Darwin theory to give meaning to the character that wants to evolve, then it's it's like not anymore the main story. And sometimes in science, if you give motives to something, like say that the hurricane wants to go and make people suffer,
Right.
people will misinterpret.
So I think often in communicating research, what science writers do is use this as the characters, and talk about like their journey in discovering this, and why they're motivated to do that, what kind of problems they've had, the history of maybe go into details of the past century of researchers who've been working on this problem and what conflicts they've what conflicts have come up with them. So I think, I think it's difficult to make characters out of inanimate objects or theories or whatever. I haven't done that yet, but it would be cool if someone if you can pull it off. But I'd say to start with making the scientist a character. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is it possible to have your PowerPoint and then
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. We were doing some research on the climate change and water resources with environment with the climate in 6 months. And we were reviewing some articles, research articles during that topic. Is that the same way we build a story? And it was like it has a different structure, like introduction and it had we were doing in the different ways, like introduction, and we were collecting some literature review, and then the discussion of the program, and then the conclusion. So this is the story, and that one is the for the journal, I think. So it is a different way to communicate the research.
Yeah. So if you're looking to promote your research, for example, and write a story on that, so one angle you could take would be to basically write a story about yourselves and your own, how you kind of got to that research and how you went through it. I think if you can, it depends on exactly what your research has involved, but if you can incorporate a story about maybe someone that would be affected by climate and water risk, and kind of weave that through, like how this research relates to someone in real life. That's another option. You can have more than one character. You could have your primary character be this person in a town that's very reliant on hydroelectric water, and then you weave yourselves as characters through the research that you've done that relates to that, but then come back to this person and how that research then will come back and affect them potentially. Does that help? So, okay, this is like a lot of things. So I think one starting point is to think about scenes. So this guy Lee Gutkind has what's called the yellow test, and this is more sort of in reading related articles that you think are good. So and learning by reading quality stuff. So you go through a piece of nonfiction that has made a big impact, and highlight any scene, which is places in the work where things are happening, where there are characters interacting, where there are characters doing something, where there's action. And I think that you would find that in most very popular nonfiction, that a lot of the text will be highlighted, because that's what's engaging, and that's what sells, and that's what gets people's attention. And then sort of a final tool is it's called the 5-box outline method from Bragg. And this is, instead of doing a very formal outline of your story, a way to begin that's a little easier, I think. So you always want to have a lead at the beginning, and this is an image or detail that draws people in. Most people have maybe heard of that concept. So then the second thing you want is a nut graph. So this is something that really sums up the story. And these can be, any of these can be images, details, a scene, or just a paragraph of information that you definitely want to include. So, sorry, the formatting. The third one is a second lead. So this is a new image, a new detail that, again, engages people. So this one grabs the attention. This one keeps them going. And it comes just before the bulk of your narrative, before the most amount of writing. Then the fourth block is necessities. So these are things that you know you have to include, but that may be not as compelling. So stuff you don't want to lead with, but you want to make sure is in there for the reader who's going to be interested. And then finally a kicker, and this is just something strong at the end that leaves the audience with an emotion and makes them want to act. And I should say, in all of these story elements, it's not exclusive to writing. So I've been talking sort of in the sphere of writing, but this applies to any kind of major communication you're doing, any video or photo essay or anything like that. Anyway, so you fill these in. That looks cheesy. Before you get started, you know, in whatever way you want. But I think it's a good starting point. Okay, so you finished your story. I think in between finishing and promotion actually is ask someone in your target audience to read it. So if this is something you want the general audience to understand and enjoy, get someone outside of your direct sphere of colleagues to read it. If it's a general audience thing, I like to ask my mom to read it. So, you know, someone that you trust to give you constructive feedback. And then when you're done, don't be shy. Like, promote it. Put it on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and all of your, you know, email it to people you think might be interested. Not to say that you should spam people, because there is a line, but you have to get it out there. And then also don't forget about it. Link back to it in later materials, especially if it's a very foundational piece that provides a lot of background information. Okay, so that's enough talking. So this interactive exercise, if you guys could get into groups of 2 or 3, I think I have 8 copies, so 8 groups at the most. Sure. There's 4 pages. Yeah, I think they're like, okay, do you want? No. Okay.
Je vais essayer de faire quelque chose, mais...
Est-ce que je me la prends aussi?
Ouais, vas-y, ouais.
Okay. So there are the first 2 things in this are 2 stories. They're both written by Elizabeth Colbert, who I think is an excellent science writer. She does a lot for the New Yorker, and they're a little different. The first one is longer, and it's actually just an excerpt of a long piece, and the second one is a complete piece that's shorter and has a little bit of a different kind of tone. But I think they're both communicating science and policy. And I think what would be maybe helpful to you is to go through and so where do you see some of these elements of story that we talked about? What about these stories engages you, or what doesn't? What information do you think you'll remember? You don't have to think about all these things. These are just examples of ways to analyze it as you read it. Will you do anything with this information? How yellow would this writing be? So this is the yellow test where you highlight if there's a scene where there's action. And do you see evidence of the 5-box outline? So maybe take about 10 minutes to read through and keep these things in mind. And then pick one of these questions to answer. We'll talk about in a group. So pick one of these answers to sort of present to yeah. Is that clear? Yeah.
Là, en fait, il faut que tu highlights l'événement de l'histoire, donc c'est-à-dire que tu vois character streets, survival problem, designers, details. Et tu peux highlighter. C'est vraiment dans le texte et tu peux après.
Oh, and I should have mentioned, sorry. Sort of, About 5 more minutes and then we'll talk about it.
Do you guys have enough time to kind of look over it? Let's gather around. Okay, so does anyone want to start with answering any of these questions, or really just any kind of thoughts you have? Yeah.
My article was about the geological story about linking the geography with the Anthropocene story, like the fact that humans are like affecting the geology and that we have entered a new geological area. I think what really clicked me on with the story was the first paragraph, because it was like it was very funny actually. Like it was like a story about the old geological society and how like old guys were like discussing incredible like scientist stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think only the fact that I laughed in the first paragraph like made it so easier like with the rest of the lecture.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was already in the mood of continuing reading.
And the main character is very real too, and he has a personality, so it makes it easier to identify with him and to really continue. It's like reading a book. Like a story. A novel. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It also automatically gives more links more to like what will we remember. Like looking at a building, looking at old building, I think like unconsciously when automatically takes this information along.
Mm-hmm.
Or the scratches of these fossils. He's so passionate about it, makes one reminded that we actually are surrounded by fossils. And I think, for example, one thing I also remember is he wants to introduce this new name that we're in the Anthropocene. Like this will I will automatically link because it will be in future discussion, I guess.
One thing that I kind of liked about it, and you try to see this kind of blog writers a little bit more often, is she's writing kind of story-like, more formally story-like, but woven into it, especially when she's describing a scene or like talking about a particular person, she'll like weave in these little bits of pop culture or like a more casual writing style, sort of almost what you would be thinking in your head if you were in that moment. So like she's talking about one of the guys and she describes him as Walter White, who's a character on the show Breaking Bad in the US. It's a really popular show about coaching meth of all things. But and then later on, she's walking through Scotland and is told a particular like word that they use for light drizzle, and then she continues to use it later on because she's like, hey, I learned a new word, now I'm going to keep using it.
Yeah.
And so I kind of like that. I feel like that type of language style makes it a piece more relatable to the person reading it, because it's just, you're like, this is kind of the way that I would think about things.
I hadn't thought about this until you said that, but it's almost like in this piece, she is the author, is the identifying character. She's the character that you're identifying. Because you're seeing everything through her eyes, and she's, as you said, she's very relatable.
And she also has like a lot of what she says, like when Saliazevich, I don't know how you pronounce it, Like he says that we are being like, so you automatically like identify with her and with they're talking actually to us, and it's true that those comes from myself.
I read the both stories very quickly, and I think the main difference between the two stories is that the first stories is the stories of the scientists, while the second stories is more about their research. And when I read the stories, I wanted to know more about what are the outcomes of the research. And so at the first stories, I was a bit disappointed because I had to read many texts about the history of the Geological Society of London, about the scientific, which can be interesting, but this is not what I expected. And so I was happy to read the story only at the end of the text. While at the contrary, on the second story, at the very first sentence, I understand what is the story about, what is the research, and I know that I would like to go to the end of the text. But this is because I have a specific expectation from this text.
Yeah, it's funny because I had exactly the opposite feeling for the first text because I found that at the very beginning she sets a very specific atmosphere. I really it's like you have a library around you all of a sudden, like with this very low light, and you really imagine a very new scene, and then you're quite curious where she wants to go to, but she does it in such a subtle way and very natural. Yeah, you're curious, but you feel okay, and you feel it's funny at the same time. So I think a little bit.
I feel like they both set the tone pretty early. Like, one, it's just that they're very, very different. Like, so the first one is what you're saying. Like, she sets this tone and like you're jumping into a book. Like, this is going to be a long story, and that comes from the fact that it's a longer form story. Whereas the second one is almost like she's setting this up to be a news article. This is telling you like what's like a much sharper right now sort of piece. I feel like they both set those up in the very beginning, and whether you kind of like one style or the other will kind of make you choose which one you like the way she set it up.
Makes me, I have a question related to that difference. When you are a hard scientist, like you do physics or maths, when you write an article, it's always, there's this code of how you are going to write it. It's for a specific review, and so you have to be very just accurate about the sciences. And sometimes I think I kind of miss having some kind of wrapping up about that. Like you are reading the thing, but then you know that you have to get the information, and well, I know where it is. I know that I have the space with data and methodology and everything. But when I read the entire article, it's impossible to read it in one time, and it takes. I think if we could wrap up a little bit more, it would be easier to get the information. And sometimes I think that hard scientists they have this kind of ego that makes it no, we are very serious people. So do you think that it could be possible to communicate between hard scientists and make it not such boring thing to read an article?
I mean, that's what a lot of people are, trying to do, and it's hard. And I think that's sort of one of the fundamental problems of communicating science is that scientists themselves need it to be regimented and very specific. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's something to work for. I don't know. Yeah, I'd say do what you can do within your sphere of, influence.
Maybe what's possible is just to take an article a very nature story without just translating to it. readable task.
Because the point with like scientists is that they kind of think that if it's for other scientists, well, they can just write information without working work.
Sure.
And often there's a big difference between people who have been there for a long time. They do presentation, they're just going to put their facts. And when I see PhD, their presentations are always better than the people who have been there for a long time.
They're still in touch. It's the, it goes back to the cognitive bias of once you know, it's impossible to know what it's like not to know, right?
So once you're 60 years old and you've been doing physics for 40 years, you don't remember what it's like to not, understand Newton's laws. So you're not gonna go when you're talking about something that's 500 years ahead of that. So yeah, I think scientists themselves have some responsibility to think about how they're communicating and how their research is being communicated, because if they only do the journal style writing, the general public is not going to benefit as much. And there are still some news outlets that cover science and cover science articles. And so that's if you're trying to learn how to communicate science, I would also suggest looking at those. So in addition to researchers I'm giving you, also looking at the New York Times and other big publishing agents. Last thing I'll say about sort of my reactions to these. So the one about the fossils is an excerpt from a New York article, which is an excerpt from her recent book. So it is this excerpt from a very larger piece. So you don't get the end of it with where she does talk about the future more and what this actually means for now. The second one, what I thought was interesting was she starts out with this very story-ish kind of opening, but she moves pretty quickly and it kind of an interesting transition into now, and kind of gets pretty opinionated, and I think that's an interesting difference. So I don't know about you, but when I read something that I can tell is more opinion oriented, I interpret it differently. So I interpret it with more of a grain of salt. I'm a little more on my guard, I guess, about what I'm taking in. Whereas when you're reading in this more complete story format, I tend to not really be on my guard as much, and I think it's just an example of how the more you kind of stick to the story format, the more you're probably going to get the information that you want to get across. But it's not always possible to do that, and but I think that incorporating it as much as you can in your writing it will help. So I kind of did on the second part of the interactive exercise, which was looking at one of these research papers that you guys have done in Bragg, and just to start a planning process of how you might go about communicating it. Obviously, we ran out of time, but I think as you guys communicate your research, even if one person is sort of in charge of maybe writing an article or producing a video, at the beginning it's nice to talk about it in a team setting where you can get different people's ideas of what might be the most effective and interesting way. These resources will be in the PowerPoint and a couple of attachments, which I assume I can get to you somehow. All right, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you.